Hey, this is Russell from NPAL Audio, and I want to show you how I turn this into this. First, we have picking up the card pack and placing it back down. Here are the sounds without any plugins or pitch modification. First, I added good old OTT to the track and turned the sounds way up to bring out the texture. OTT also brute forced out much of the harshness. I then pitched the sounds down to help them sound a little less metallic, but consequently they actually sounded a little more metallic. So finally, I added a low-pass filter to carve out more of that metallic harshness, a low shelf to remove some low rumbly noise, and modulated a pretty aggressive bell curve to give more movement to the sounds. Next up is what I call the blue power whoosh. This was an interesting challenge, turning a very tonal and kinetic sound into essentially a windy noise. I have a few layers: the power up and power down layer, the tonal layer, and the airy whoosh layer. I'll start by breaking down the tonal layer. Here, I just pitched my car key sound way down. It's at a rate of just 0.013 and sounds like this. I then added a few plugins. I started off with, yet again, OTT. I noticed that it brought in some really interesting high-end information that I wanted to focus on, so I added a high-pass filter and a high shelf before OTT. I then added Valhalla Space Modulator for some texture, and Valhalla Supermassive for some width. The real sauce comes from GRM's Space Grain, and here I have the sound repeating several times at a lower, slightly randomized pitch with some dispersion. This makes each repeat of the sound auto-pan away from its origin point, in this case, the center. Lastly, I added some reverb with Native Instruments Realm, I think that's how it's pronounced, to make the sound stereo image a little more diffuse. Now onto the airy whoosh layer. This one is very similar to the tonal layer, but with a few tweaks. Here is the initial audio. As for the effects, just like the tonal layer, I used OTT, Valhalla Space Mod, Valhalla Supermassive, and GRM Space Grain. Note that I am not using any EQ before OTT and also no reverb. In Space Grain, I have 36 grains instead of just 9, less dispersion, and the pitch is all the way down. Altogether, we get this sound? I remember thinking this was a really strange but interesting sound, so I rendered it and put it on a new track. On this new track, I pitch modulated the clip to line up with the powering up and down of the blue power field. I then added the one and only kilohertz snap heap. In Snap Heap, I made 3 lanes run in parallel and added a notch filter and a flanger to each lane. I put each cutoff and bandwidth to a slightly different value and turned on the scroll function in each flanger, each with different motion settings. I then added 3 random LFOs and used them to modulate the filter cutoffs independently. The idea was to get a nice whooshy movement sound. After the 3 parallel lanes, I added an ensemble to give even more width and movement. A low-pass filter with audio follower modulation for, you guessed it, more movement, and a dual delay for even more chaos and diffusion. I called this preset the Magic Swisherizer.
It sounds pretty neat on voices too.
Since these have random LFOs, I rendered out 4 or so takes of this effect and layered them on some new tracks. On one of the tracks, I added some delay and an instance of kilohertz ensemble. I routed all of these into a folder track with my Magic Swisherizer again and some reverb. Altogether, it sounds like this.
Whooshy.
I layered this along with the tonal whoosh and added some chorus and more reverb for something like this. Pretty cool, but I didn't think it had enough oomph at the power up and power down segments of the sound. So I cut up the noisy whoosh and turned up some sections. I added some pitch modulation, reversed a couple sections, and added another chorus effect. After layering it all together, it sounds like this. Phew, that one was complicated. This next piece I call the activate sound. It's only a single layer. Here it is without any plugins. With this one, I started with a preset in Kilohearts Multipass called NOTT. It's essentially an OTT clone, but with different tone and controls. I then added an effects chain I call Magic Distort to Verb. It's just a saturator turned way up, as you can see, leading into a reverb that's 100% wet. This sounded neat, but I thought the overall tone or timbre of the sound could be better. I tried adding some pitch modulation, this time with a plugin instead of directly on the track. I moved the order of the plugin several times before settling on putting the pitch plugin first. It sounded a bit rumbly and a tad disjointed, so I tried throwing on a multiband limiter, and like magic, the sound glued together. To make this sound whiter, I used Doubler 4 by Waves. Next up is the card's power-up sound. This one was fun because I used a plugin I'm not familiar with in the least. I first slowed down the car keys and reversed them to get this sound. I then added a free plugin called Spectral Compressor by Robert Vanderhelm. You can find it on GitHub, link in the description. I played around with the settings until I settled on this. I rendered out this sound and played with it on a new track. On this track, I added a flanger for a tad more movement and an EQ with a bump in the high mids for some presence. That's it. This next sound I call the Purple Burst. It's made up of 3 layers. Here they are. And here they are without any processing. On this first layer, I added my Magic Distort to Verb chain and threw an instance of Snap Heap in the middle. I made a Snap Heap preset called Grain Maker that turns any sound into a whooshy, particle-y sound. I will link it along with my other Snap Heap presets in the description. The second layer is just the sound of the keys. The third layer is the key sound with some delay baked into it. The plugins are as follows: pitching down almost 17 semitones, an aggressive EQ boosting the high end, scooping out some low mids along with a rumble removing high pass filter. Another instance of my Magic Distort to Verb chain with 2 transient controllers and a limiter in between. The transient controllers are reshaping it to have much more attack and remove some sustain that didn't feel appropriate. Finally, the pack opening sound. This one was done in a few steps. Step 1. Find a suitable car key sound and add OTT along with Snap Heap. In Snap Heap, I created a preset called Shimmerizer. This one filters out all but the high end of a sound and adds a nice shimmery delay effect. Step 2. Render sound and place into sampler. In my case, Phase Plant. I played with the unison settings a lot in Phase Plant until settling on 6 voices on the octave setting. I turned the root all the way to C8, added a little vibrato via FM synthesis, some compression, played with the new filter table plugin, and added a touch of delay. Link to this preset is also in the description. Step 3. Render out this new effect. I played a really low note to get this sound. Added a ping pong delay and some reverb. Step 4. Make a low end layer. Pitch the car keys down a ton,
0.005 times the normal rate. Add a low pass filter way down. Pitch it down a little more to get the resonant frequency in the right spot. Smash the crap out of it with a limiter. Add some overdrive. Slap on disperser and tweak until it sounds fun. Then add some reverb.
Voila! You've got the pack opening sound. And that's all.